never going to have that perfect knowledge of God. It will always be a little bit confused, a little bit distorted, based upon how we come to know Him. Now, Aquinas would say we can remedy that through God's own revelation of Himself through Scripture, but if we're just approaching the subject through human reason, we're always going to come up a little bit short. Okay, so the cosmological argument. Aquinas scholars have also dubbed this the 5 ways, because in our excerpt for this week, we know that Aquinas gave 5 different ways or 5 different proofs. And as we're going to see, each of the 5 ways isn't so different. I mean, they all basically take the same form, and they argue in the same way. Well, to kind of back up here, a cosmological argument, at least as Aquinas understands it, depends upon a couple things in order for this argument to work. Number one, the intellect has to be directed toward material being as the object of knowledge. In other words, Aquinas thinks that our intellect knows something because it's attracted to it. So our intellect is naturally oriented to material objects. That's probably a better way of saying it. That our intellect is naturally directed toward material objects. And this is our basic orientation in the world. I mean, we look around us and we see physical, material things. So that's really the starting point of this cosmological argument. We start with material reality around us. Now, according to Aquinas, material being, material reality, reflects or reveals the character of God. So in order for this argument to work, there has to be enough of a relationship between material reality and God in order that material reality will properly reflect God. So in our natural orientation towards being, we can learn something about the divine being. We can learn something about God as He has revealed Himself through material reality, through natural being. Now, all of this is really to say that we can know God imperfectly, distortedly, because the creature, that which God has created, tends to reflect and reveal the Creator. And Thomas uses a very mundane example to illustrate this point. Say, for example, you have a craftsman. That craftsman makes an object. Well, something about that craftsman is reflected in that object. The object is more than just a wooden object, a wooden table, for example. Well, there's something about the maker, the craftsman, that's put into that object that ultimately reflects who the craftsman is. That reflects the craftsman's intelligence. Well, likewise, Aquinas argues, God in creating the world left His own imprint, right? Left His own image in the creation. So that by studying nature, by studying creation, we can learn something about God. I mean, ultimately, if these couple points here aren't in place, the cosmological argument really wouldn't work, because there would be no relationship between the creature and the creator. There would be nothing in the creation that would even resemble the creator, in which case you could never prove that God exists by examining nature. They would be polar opposites. Okay, so there has to be at least some reflection. There has to be some resemblance in nature of the Creator himself. Okay, so Aquinas' 5 ways. It's a real short excerpt in our textbook, and Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, doesn't spend a whole lot of time developing these 5 proofs. In fact, Thomas is often criticized for leaving out essential information that you would need in order to really develop these proofs. And I think there's a good reason why he does that. So if I was going to argue in defense of Thomas, I would point out that his Summa Theologica is really only a summary of theology. So a summary, as we know, is not a full detailed account of something. I mean, a summary deals with the high points, the major points, and then you quickly move along. Well, that's essentially what the Summa is. Now, it's a massive work, and one could spend their lifetime studying it. And it's really crazy that the book was meant to be an introduction to theology students, because it is so massive and it's very complex, and you could spend a lifetime studying it. But in Thomas's other works, such as his commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics, his commentary on the Physics, and his other Summa, he goes into greater detail as to how these arguments would work. And unfortunately, many scholars today tend to neglect those other works because they're even more complex than the Summa. So everyone wants to focus on the arguments in the Summa, whereas these are meant to be more of an introduction or just a summary, a highlighting of the main points, whereas Thomas's fuller account are in those other commentaries and his other Summa, where he gets into much greater detail. Okay, that said, the first of the 5 ways deals with motion or change. The second of the 5 ways deals with efficient causation. The third with possibility and necessity. The fourth from the gradation of things. And finally, number 5, the 5th way, deals with the governance of the world, or the design of the natural world. So Thomas here gives 5 different ways. He's pointing to 5 different phenomena in nature. Motion or change, which he thinks is the most evident or the most manifest way to prove God. Now it's interesting that the argument from motion, the first of the 5 ways, Thomas is taking this straight from Aristotle. Aristotle, in his Physics and Metaphysics, argues essentially the same way as Thomas does here. That motion itself, or whatever is put in motion, must be put in motion by another. Right? Nothing can put itself in motion. It has to be acted upon by something that's already in motion. Now, this process, both Aristotle and Aquinas argue, can't go on forever. You can't have an infinite regress of movers. Therefore, you ultimately have to get to a starting point, to a first mover, which Aristotle famously called this unmoved mover. And for Thomas, this first mover, everyone understands to be God. Now, it's interesting that Thomas thought that this is the most evident or manifest way to prove God. And what he means by this is that motion or change is something that all of us experience. So there's nothing out of the ordinary by saying that things are in motion or that things go through change. It's common sense, which is why Thomas refers to it as the most manifest way to prove God. Okay, so we got motion and change. We got cause and effect, possibility and necessity.